you? It's a beautiful day out there. It's lovely and sunny, and not quite cloudless skies, but blue and fluffy white clouds. So, how are you this wonderful day? This creature is Zurg from Toy Story, just in case you were wondering. I quite often point out weird little things that look like they're coming out of my head. So there we are. We're halfway through the book of Exodus, and we should, if I can go fast enough, finish Exodus today. So there we are. There's the challenge for today. It's quite a lot to cover, but we'll have a good go. We'll get on with it straight away. We've got to the fifth section of Exodus, which is called Delivered and Drowned. Let's look at the route that the Israelites took to freedom. There are three options. The northern route, they left Goshen and they went through a row of sandbanks which is situated in the shallow part of the Mediterranean Sea, which you can still see on the map. It's at the top of the map, and they couldn't be followed across the sandbanks by the chariots by Lake Sidonis, and they went on to Kadesh Barnea. The middle route, the middle route was that they went straight across to Kadesh Barnea, but there was a line of fortresses roughly where the Suez Canal is today, and the Egyptians had a very strong line of defence here against attacks from the east, and they would have had to get through that line of fortresses, which I think is pretty unlikely. They weren't armed and they weren't able to fight, and that's the second option. The third option, which is more likely to me, is the third route was to take them through the Reed Sea and down via Mara and Elim to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses had lived. He knew this country. He had been a shepherd there for 40 years, and Jebel Musa, as the mountain is called today, is a traditional there's a long tradition which in the Middle East, which puts Sinai down at the bottom of this run, and Sinai was where Moses received the Ten Commandments. The Bible doesn't say that God divided the Red Sea. What it does say is that he sent an east wind which divided the Red Sea. And I was watching a TV program last night about this, and it is possible for an east wind to push the sea back if there's a place where there's a lake, and then the Reed Sea, and then the Red Sea, and if an east wind was coming this way, it would push that across, and if the tide was going out, there would be a period of about 4 to 5 hours, maybe up to 8 hours, where this phenomenon could happen. Any way you look at it, it's a miracle. Whether it's big walls of water and people running straight through, that's a miracle because God had to do that himself. Whether it's the east wind being blown and them walking across on dry land, that's a miracle because it's a matter of God had to send the east wind, and this had to happen specifically at the time that the Israelites were there. And then when the east wind stops, there's a period of calm, and then the waters come crashing back in. The Great Bitter Lakes were joined to the Red Sea. They were joined by a shallow sea called the Reed Sea. And the Hebrew is far more likely to be the Reed Sea rather than the Red Sea. But we have it in our translations as the Red Sea. The Great Bitter Lake is, in those days, was joined up to the Red Sea through a marshy channel called the Reed Sea. It's all completely dried up now, and the fortified line came down to the other side of the lake. Pharaoh would only let them go into the desert. If he wanted them back, he thought he could just go and get them. And they camped by the side of the Reed Sea. They were hidden by a cloud. God sent a cloud to hide the Israelites from the Egyptians. Now, an east wind would have driven the water from the lake back into the lake, and the tide from the Red Sea went out at the same time. But it doesn't explain the miracle as an east wind coming at exactly the right time. Any which way you look at this is a miraculous event. But why did the east wind come at exactly the right time? The answer is simple. It's God. God sent it. And it's still a miracle. By looking at this in a down-to-earth way, we are not trying to explain away the miracle. At the very least, it's a miracle of coincidence. But in the Bible, there's no coincidences. There's only providence. If you look at a satellite photo of the area, now you can see where the Reed Sea was, but has dried up. By travelling this way, they avoided the fortified line on the eastern front of Egypt. The striking fact about this crossing of the Reed Sea, or the Red Sea, is that it happened on the third day. On the third day after the Passover, lamb was killed, the liberation came. In the Bible, it says the very hour in which the Passover lamb had to be killed. And that had to be killed in the midst of the afternoon on the day before Passover, which was 3 p.m. on the third day after that they escaped. And they're free from Pharaoh now, and they never see him again. Let's now move on to the next section, provided and protected. They are now in a place where there is no support for human life, except a few Bedouins. This place is desolate, and it's certainly not a place to take 2.5 million people. As I said last time, there are debates on the numbers. Some have it down as low as 20,000 people, and some have it as high as 2.5 million. Either way, it's they're in a place which is devoid of food and water. there was no food and water. Where do you get enough of either? The answer is God has to provide it. God's put them in this position, so he's got to provide the food. And he provided them with little pieces of bread scattered on the floor. When they harvested it, they found it's edible, and they named it in Hebrew manna, which means, what is it? So when a little child is asking, what are we having for dinner? What is it? What are we having for tea? What is it? What are we having for breakfast? What is it? And what is it sufficed them, and they lived on it for 40 years. It was literally bread from heaven. They complained bitterly that they weren't getting any meat because they'd had a high protein diet in Egypt of meat and fish. Don't complain to God. you may get what you want. And God sent them quail to eat. Now you may think, this is cool. God sends them quail. But he sent quail in abundance. So many quail that, hiya Billy, so many quail that they were lying 1.5 meters deep on the floor, which is probably up to about here. Up to my up and above my waist as I'm sitting down. They ate quail until it made them sick. What about water? Well, they had a real problem with water. The first oasis they came to was called Mara, and the water was bad there. It was brackish and salty, and it was horrible. So God simply made it drinkable through Moses. And the second oasis that they came to was Elim, and the next place they came, which they came to, Elim, there was good water there. So God provided for them. When the water was bad, God changed it and led them to good water. They would have needed about 2 million gallons a day for that many people and animals. And later they would get water from rock reservoirs, and also their shoes never wore out. When you're in the deserts, especially the Sinai Desert, your shoes wear out very quickly because they're constantly walking on rocks and stones, and yet their shoes never wore out. This would have been a major miracle back then. Not so much today. But in that culture, they would have recognized the magnitude of this miracle. It's a major miracle today, thinking, oh well, you maybe have a pair of shoes for a year and a half. Women every couple of weeks. That was very sexist of me. But you could quite prominently see how this would have been a very prominent miracle in those days. You either have to acknowledge that this is true and God did it all, or you have to dismiss it as legend. There's no real in between. They had internal problems too. Can you imagine that number of people camping today? It's no wonder that one of the biggest problems that Moses had was disputes between people, and he had to judge them all. And they came to him with all of their problems. And it was Moses' father-in-law that had a good deal more sense than Moses. And he told Moses to delegate. So he appointed 70 leaders. But Moses, his father-in-law, wasn't even one of God's people, and yet he came up with the idea. It's amazing how God can use people without faith. We now move into the second half, so we're in chapters 19 and onwards, and the next thing that comes about is the Ten Commandments, written with God's finger on 2 tablets of stone. Now we often see pictures of the Ten Commandments on the 2 tablets, 5 and 5 or 4 and 6, but it wasn't that way. They were written 10 and 10. Why? Because this was a legal contract. 1 copy for the people and 1 copy for God. You understand now why there were 2 tablets, because there should be 2 copies, 1 for each party. But God wrote both, because this was a covenant, not a contract. It was a covenant where God said, this is how you are to live. And he gave them 3 legal collections: the 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, the Book of the Covenant, which we find in chapters 20 to 23 of Exodus, and there's another book of laws in chapters 25 to 31 to 32, depending on which Bible you're reading, which are laws of worship. All these make up the laws of Moses, and there are more in the book of Deuteronomy as well. But the law is not just the 10 Commandments. There are actually 613 laws and regulations that for them to live right before God. But let's start with the 10 Commandments. There are 3 basic principles. 2 that I want to mention in detail. The principle of respect is the first one. The 10 Commandments are based on that principle. Respect God. Respect for his name. Respect for his day. Respect for his people. Respect for family life. Honor your mother and father. Respect for your father and mother. Respect for your life, for life itself. Don't murder. Respect for marriage. Don't commit adultery. Respect for people's property. Don't steal. Respect for people's reputation. Don't bear false witness. A healthy, holy society is built on respect. We can see in our society what happens when respect disappears, but God's law is based on respect. Loving God and loving your neighbour can be translated as respecting God and respecting your neighbour. Loss of respect for God leads you into idolatry, and the loss of respect for humanity leads you into immorality and injustice. So, in this way, we can see how the law is made up. It's a good law. And all the laws that God lays out are for our benefit. It's just the rebellious part of us that makes us say, well, I'm not following God's law. But when you look at them rationally, all the laws are for our benefit. But so in this way, you can see how the law is made up. It's a good law. Most of the 10 Commandments are about acts or deeds, but the last of the 10 Commandments is about feelings. It's the only one about the heart. Maybe it's why Paul said he kept all 9, but he couldn't manage the 10th. And the 10th one is don't be greedy. Don't want what you haven't got. It's the only one concerned with your inner life. and the respect and the rest are concentrated on behaviour. This is the principle, or there's a principle to do with these 10 laws, which Jewish boys and girls learn on their fingers. If you break one, you've broken them all, because they belong together like a necklace, like a pearl necklace. If you break the necklace, the beads go everywhere, and they are scattered and lost. And there are 10 separate commandments that make up one law. It's sort of like a pizza that has enough sections cut in it for 10. It's a whole pizza until someone takes one of the slices, and then it's broken. And if you break it, if you break one commandment, you've broken the lot. It's spoilt. It's in pieces if you break it at any point. It doesn't matter how many laws you keep. It's the one that you've broken that matters, and that makes you guilty. Respect is a whole thing. You either respect or you don't. And you show that you don't respect them by breaking one. The second principle is responsibility. We are brought up to believe the people not responsible for their actions, even down to saying the wickedness is down to a gene. This type of thinking rids us of responsibilities for what we do. The law of God says you are responsible, you are accountable. You have chosen to break this law. Just like we choose to be offended. Yes, that's right. We choose to be offended. We choose which offences bother us. You have chosen to break the rules, and it holds us responsible before God. Every one of us is supposed to live right before God. So the two principles of respect and responsibility, and that brings us to the third principle, retribution. There are sanctions in this law. One of them is capital punishment. The death penalty is applied to 18 different sins against God in the law of Moses. Aren't you glad that we're not living under the law of Moses? Because breaking the Sabbath is the death penalty. There is retribution here. There is punishment. And there's a very specific line on the difference between doing things on purpose or intentionally and doing things by accident. There are two types of killing. There's intentional murder and accidental manslaughter. There's no sacrifice in the Mosaic law for continued, deliberate, intentional sin. And there isn't in the New Testament either. Read the letter of Hebrews. Well, this law is given in a context, and the context is this. I brought you out of Egypt, and I will bring you into Canaan. And this is how you will live now. So God's basically saying, I brought you out, and I'm giving you a new set of laws to live by, and this is how you will live now. That's an important point. on the basis of what God has done for them and what he will do for them, then he appeals to them to live right and live right now. And it's the same in the New Testament. It's on the basis of what God has done for you and what he's going to do for you. And he says now, this is how I want you to live. Without that context, the law becomes a harsh, impersonal, horrid thing. But in this context, because it becomes a good thing, it fits. And the response of gratitude is God's grace. Then we come to the fact that God wants to live with them. He gave them the 10 Commandments at the top of Mount Sinai. God said, don't touch my mountain, which if you ever see the Mount Sinai just erupts straight out of the ground, straight out of the valley floor. And they had to put a fence around it to stop people touching it. God wanted them to realize that he was a holy God, and not just anybody could come up and talk to him. Moses erected a fence at the bottom of the mountain. Moses and Aaron could come up to the mountain, but no one else. But now God says, now he's given Moses the 10 Commandments in the middle of lightning and thunderstorm and fire. It must have been an awesome sight. Awesome and terrifying. But now God wanted to come down and live in the camp with them. But if I do, says God, it must be a tent that communicates my holiness. A tent that you must treat respectfully and treat with awe and reverence. It should be a holy place. And right in the middle of the tent will be where I live, which is called the Holy of Holies. And so God gave them specifications for his tent. It had to be right in the middle of the camp, with the other tents had to be arranged around it in a special order. And immediately around it were the priests and the Levites, so that they were between the ordinary people and the holy place. And the tent itself would be fenced off with one entrance. And then God's tent was inside that. And it had 2 rooms. The inner room was God's room. And into that place, once a year, one man could go. Nobody else ever went. And the whole tent is full of detail. It was a beautiful thing, and yet most of its beauty was hidden. It had beautiful embroidery and curtains and coverings, and yet this beauty was all covered with a badger skin covering over the top. All the people would see was this rough surface, knowing that inside was a gold seats and exquisite embroidery in all sorts of colours. Blue, the colour of heaven; red, the colour of blood; silver and gold, with a high outer fence which you couldn't see over. It had mystery attached to it. And there was in fact an altar inside the tent for the priests to sacrifice before they entered. Moving into the first room, the vestibule or the anteroom of God's palace, so to speak, we had the table of the showbread, the 7-branch candlestick, another little altar. A priest could come into God, would have to go to the altar outside the actual tent, and sacrifice and to God outside the tent. And then they moved to a great big basin to wash themselves clean. And then they moved into the anteroom. The whole thing is saying, if you are going to come to God, you're going to have to sacrifice first, and then you're going to have to be clean. This is the full of meaning. And God said, this is a copy of where I live in heaven, and this is a replica of the real thing. And in the Holy of Holies, there is one piece of furniture, a shittim wood covered with gold, the mercy seat, with cherubs atop of it, and inside some manna and the pieces of tablet. And they never saw the mercy seat. Even when the tent was dismantled and moved, the seat was covered up. And the tent had to be carried by special people. Ordinary people had to keep 1,000 paces away until it was erected again. And it had to be erected by specific people as well. And it had to be the first tent that was put up. It all spoke of God's holiness. And yet it also spoke of a holy God who is willing to live in the middle of his people. We have lost something of awe and reverence. This is required for a holy God. We are altogether too pally with him now. And this is my own personal feeling. I think that we've lost a little bit of awe and reverence to God. Even the priest's clothing was specified. The high priest wore on his chest the 12 jewels, which represented the 12 tribes. And the 12 jewels are mentioned in the last pages of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, in the New Jerusalem. It's full of meaning, full of symbolism. And God says only special people could use this, the priests, and only special people can build it. And that's when he gave them their incredible skills. You remember that they were people who for 400 years had only worked with mud and clay and bricks, and God gave them the skills to work with gold and silver and wood. You would have thought that this would have taught the people something about God's utter holiness. But Moses goes up a mountain for a month, and all that counts for nothing, because Aaron stayed down this time. The people came to Aaron and said, we're disgruntled. Moses is at the top of this mountain for a long time. We don't think he's coming back. We want a God down here. So Aaron said, give me your gold. And they gave him their gold. And Aaron said later to Moses, I just put it in a melting pot and out came this bull. That's a feeble excuse. He's basically a barefaced liar. And the bull is a symbol of wealth and fertility. It is an Egyptian god. And there's a golden bull outside the European Stock Exchange in Frankfurt. Make of that what you will. And because idolatry leads to immorality, because the loss of respect for God leads to the loss of respect for people, they had a wild orgy, and it was really, really sordid. And when Moses came back down, he broke both copies of the law. He was symbolizing what they had done already by smashing the covenant. He said, how could you do this? And he made the people eat their own sin, as in he crushed the bull up and sprinkled the gold that was left in their drinking water. So they drank the bull. And it actually says Moses burnt the golden calf in a fire, ground it to powder, scattered it in the water, and forced the Israelites to drink it. And then he went back up the mountain. And he said, God, I'm fed up with them. And God said, so am I. And God said, I think I'm going to finish them with them, and I'll try someone else. And that's when Moses reached, if you like, the height of his career. He took the form of a priest at this point, and he said, well, God, if you're going to blot them out of your book, then you'll have to blot me out. I don't want to be the only one left. And that was a really priestly thing to say. And God replied, I only blot out of my book the names of those who sin against me, and you haven't. And that was God saying that he'd carry on with the Israelites. And that type of attitude is throughout the Bible. David asked not to be blotted out of God's book. And in the last book of the Bible, Jesus says, he promises, he who overcomes, I will not blot out his name from my book. And the most important thing in life is to keep your name in that book, the book of life. And Moses insisted on that the people were punished, and 3,000 people died. The law was given on Mount Sinai on the 50th day after they had the Passover meal. The Passover lamb was killed 50 days previously, and 3,000 people were killed. And after Jesus had gone up to heaven on the 50th day, the Passover came and 3,000 people were saved. God has everything in hand. Let's put this together. The Passover lamb was killed at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, the same time as Jesus. On the third day after that, they were liberated. On the 50th day, after that, they called the day Pentecost. They were given the law, and 3,000 people died through breaking it. Now let's put this together with the story of Jesus. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus dies. 3 days later, he's raised and liberates his people from sin. On the 50th day after that, after Jesus' death, God gives his Spirit to his people, and 3,000 people are saved. Amazing how the Bible all fits together. You need the Old Testament to put the New Testament into context. You need the book of Exodus. You need all of the books in the Old Testament. I hear quite a few preachers saying the Old Testament is null and void. It's not null and void. You really need the Old Testament to understand the New Testament. Well, we move on to construction and consecration. Where did they get all this gold from? 1 ton of gold was used in the making of this tent? Well, it says each man gave a fifth of an ounce, or 6 grams each. Where did they get this gold? It's plain and simple, off the Egyptians. The Egyptians wanted rid of them, so they gave them all the gold and jewellery to take with them. Hi, John. But it says, for the construction of the tabernacle, the people gave spontaneously, thoughtfully, regularly and generously. Actually, they had to be stopped giving. Wouldn't it be great if all our churches ran on the same basis? If only we always gave like that. And finally God takes up residence, and they saw the glory coming, and from then on saw the plume of smoke. It was above the inner room, and the inner room had no lights whatsoever, but it was always ablaze with lightning. And when they saw the smoke move, they knew that they had to move. And when it stopped, they camped. What's the Christian use for the book of Exodus? Well, it's the same God. He hasn't changed. And he hasn't changed, and he deals with us in just the same way as he dealt with them. That's why many of the same words used in Exodus are used in the New Testament. Words like covenant, blood, lamb, Passover, Exodus, leaven, all these words are used in the New Testament. But we need to refer to the book of Exodus for their meaning. And yet we are different. We're not under the law of Moses. We're under the law of Christ. That's very important. Now, in many ways it's harder, and in many ways it's easier. But the first ways the Christians have related to Exodus, the Christians have related Exodus to Jesus, and they see Christ in this book. Christ says, search for me in the scriptures and you'll find me. When Christ was saying that, he was talking about finding himself in the Old Testament, not in the New. Now, Exodus is central to the Exodus. All the books after it look back to this point as the redemption on which everything else is based. The cross is central to the New Testament, but the Exodus was central to the Old Testament. In what way is the Exodus connected to the cross? 6 months before he died, Jesus was on top of Mount Hermon, and he talked with Moses. And Luke's Gospel tells us what they talked about. They talked about the Exodus, which Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. That's the main conjoining point. Jesus died at the very minute that thousands of Passover lambs were being killed back in the book of Exodus. This is why Paul says Christ was a Passover lamb. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us. The angel of death can pass over us. He rose from the grave on the 3rd day, and it's his resurrection that liberates us from death. He is the bread from heaven. The New Testament says he is the rock from which Moses drew the water. John says the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. He pitched a tent, and in his tent he was amongst us. For a tabernacle for the tabernacle to us is Jesus. Jesus is amongst us. God dwelling in the midst of his people. So we understand Christ better now. And he said he didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. So we apply the book of Exodus not only to Christ, but also to Christians. For example, crossing the Red Sea prefigures baptism. Paul says the children of Israel were baptized into Moses in the Red Sea, and we are baptized into Christ. What crossing the Red Sea was for them, your baptism is for you. We too have a Passover meal. The Lord's Supper is simply a Passover meal, remembering the liberation of Christ. Paul says, rise and keep the festival, but not with leaven of malice and wickedness. There's an equivalent of unleavened bread in the Christian life. Leaven in the New Testament is usually a picture of malice and bad things. In many ways, the law of Christ is much harder than the law of Moses. The law of Moses says don't kill anyone, but the law of Christ says, have you ever wished anyone dead? The law of Moses says don't commit adultery. I never have. But the law of Christ says, have you ever thought about it, however briefly? Guilty. That's much harder, and yet it's much easier. We don't have need of a lot of priests. We don't have a lot of special buildings. Whenever we pray, we enter the Holy of Holies ourselves, personally, unhindered, in the name of Jesus. There's a big difference from the new to the old. Under the law given at Pentecost, 3,000 died. Under the Spirit given at Pentecost, 3,000 lived. Wouldn't you rather have the Spirit rather than the law? The Spirit writes the law inside of each of us. But there is still a future deliverance for Christians equivalent to the Exodus. If you read in Revelations, you'll see the plagues of the Pharaohs are going to happen all over again. There is an astonishing correlation between the plagues at the end of history and the plagues of the Pharaohs. Those who remain faithful to Jesus will come through all that and be victorious. The book of Revelation says all the martyrs and those who overcome all the pressures outside and the temptations inside will sing the song of Moses. In heaven you'll hear the song of Moses. And if you go back to Exodus 15, the first song in the Bible, the song composed by Miriam to celebrate the drowning of the Egyptians in the Red Sea. And when all this world's troubles are and we are gone and we are safe in glory, we can then sing the song of Moses. We will have a double exodus. The exodus of the cross, which has happened already, and then the escape from all our troubles and our sin that's coming through the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, I've managed to get through it, and that's with 10 minutes to go. So there we've finished the book of Exodus. Next one is the book of Leviticus. Don't avoid it. The book of Leviticus is a fantastic book, and so many people avoid the book of Leviticus because it's seen as a dead book. It's nothing of the sort. Be with me next week as I venture into the book of Leviticus. God bless. Bye.